For the purposes of this course, we're going to do a limited look at assessment of intellectual functioning. These are instruments that would be used strictly by school psychologists or clinical psychologists. And so our greater concern, although we may have some students in the class who are training in those fields, our concern here is what would the results tell us and how would they be useful to us. It's important to recognize that in many areas with ASD, we cannot look at epidemiological studies with much assurance of who was being included under that umbrella at the time of the study, even if they were fairly recent. So many of the past statistics that talk a lot about the overlap between ASD and ID are giving us statistics that would be great exaggerations or over identification of the percentage of folks who share these two characteristics once we add in all of the high functioning individuals who are now being identified under the umbrella. So that's important to note. You can be diagnosed with ASD with a range of IQs, a total range of IQs. So you may be identified with an intellectual disability and you may be identified in the gifted range and everything in between. So that's critical to keep in mind. The reason we want to know about an individual's cognitive abilities is, again, for the purposes of planning materials that suit them and fit their needs. And that's the reason that IQ is a part of a diagnostic initial evaluation. What the IQ then does for us, particularly in the planning of programming for students with ASD, is give us some strengths and weaknesses that we do not get from other instruments that are going to be used in that comprehensive diagnostic. So the kind of information that is really helpful to us on an intellectual scale are things like perceptual abilities and attention and problem solving. But there's a huge caveat with all of these in that it's very difficult in many cases to measure the validity of our scores based on whether or not we are getting from that individual, under the circumstances of the testing itself, their full potential measured appropriately. So there are many challenges in measuring an individual's IQ. These are evaluations that are done in a one-to-one setting, typically. Very scripted, of course, protected tests. And the concern with folks on the spectrum is that their symptoms, in fact, interfere with their performance on many of the tests they might be asked to do, depending upon which of these instruments you choose. Obviously, communication skills are critical. There's a lot of oral interaction for high-functioning folks on an IQ scale. Just simply the testing surroundings and know whether or not they're comfortable and know the person who is doing the assessment. Any anxiety they might feel about a variety of things, the change in environment, being in a different area to have the testing done in a quiet space, being away from their typical schedule, which could be of great stress to them. And then their ability to change focus, which we know is a possible strong characteristic in some folks, would definitely interfere with their need to switch to certain multiple activities throughout the entire testing. So a special interest focus that they'd have difficulty letting go of would interfere with their participation fully in what they're being asked to do during this test administration. There are obviously scales, developmental skills for infants and cognitive skills through adulthood. We have concerns about validity of any individual very early on because of the small number of behaviors that we can measure. But again, that validity concern continues with this population based on characteristics of the disability itself that would render a lot of the performance invalid. So a lot of clinical judgment needs to go into these administrations. They're still very useful exercising, gaining information, if we stop focusing so much on a score and much more on the clinical judgment about what is going on. So strengths and weaknesses are not just about the subtest score itself, but can be very helpful to teachers and practitioners later just to know where interests lie most strongly, where focus is, you know, sharper or really difficult for the individual. So many behaviors that would be important for a teacher to understand can be um, recorded and noted and measured to some degree during the administration of an assessment like this because of the one-to-one setting and the clinical judgment of the assessor. Of course, we cannot look at intellectual disability alone with an IQ score. We must always consider adaptive behavior. So once again, those scales that we've talked about several times have to be a coordinated piece of any assessment to get as good a picture as we can of cognitive functioning of someone we suspect to be on the spectrum. The practitioner, the school psychologist, the clinical psychologist, the psychometrist would choose the cognitive ability instrument based on what they know about the individual. And they need to know things like their language ability, obviously. Um, Age is calculated, again, as everyone knows, down to the day, so that you are measuring at the proper beginning and ending points, and knowing what kind of behavioral difficulties you're likely to encounter that would interfere with the person performing the task that you are attempting to assess. And also, your choice of instrument always has a lot to do with what is it you want to find out. That's obvious in any decision around what instruments to use in an assessment. So these would be considerations when choosing a cognitive ability test as they are with any other assessment.